out of the discussion entirely. There is no better introduction to the philosophical debates about consciousness than that collection of book reviews by John Searle, packaged as The Mystery of Consciousness. Almost all the important players are there. The book's a little bit old, so, for example, Searle hasn't had a chance to talk about Alva Noe's theory and all of that, but basically, I think that's a fair representation in that book about what the philosophical debates are all about. And there are two that are especially important. Dan Dennett and his kind of functionalist approach to consciousness, and David Chalmers with his hyped up, super duper 20th century version of Cartesian dualism. And then, Searle doesn't really talk about his own position all that much. Ravenshuo does, and Searle talks about it a little bit in the introduction. But when he critiques people like Dennett and Chalmers, Searle comes at that critique from a position that he now calls biological naturalism, which basically is another way of trying to get around the Cartesian impasse. And the way he does it is by saying Descartes got it wrong, okay? That mind and body aren't two different kinds of things, okay? Mind is basically a causal property of brain. That is, it's something that the brain does. It's not a different kind of thing. It's not a different kind of substance. And because we define mental states as products of brain activity, that basically allows us to get around Descartes' impasse and stop asking stupid questions, as I think Searle would be the first to put it. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Cartesian and there are two different ways of thinking about Descartes' name. Okay, it's just one of these other things that philosophy gives us. Okay. Anything else here? All right. So then I tried to argue that there's not one mind-body problem. There are actually four mind-body problems. The first of these is the traditional mind-body problem, which is how do you get minds out of bodies? Okay. How do you get what are the neural correlates of consciousness? What kinds of physical processes are critical for generating conscious mental states? And notice that this isn't a solution to the explanatory. It doesn't close the explanatory gap, and it's not a solution to the hard problem. It's basically a way of getting work done. Okay. This question about how do brain states generate conscious mental states, or why do brain states generate conscious mental states? Those are questions that we may never be able to answer satisfactorily. But in the meantime, we can at least try to figure out what brain states are involved in conscious mental states, and that's what that search is all about. Turn that around, and you get the relationship between mental states and physical states, where mental states, states of belief or feeling or desire, seem to have a causal influence on various kinds of bodily processes. The classic example are placebo effects, where the belief that you're taking a particular medication has effects on your body. The belief comes first, the physical response comes second. Okay? And then there's this question about whether you can have minds without bodies, which is these days a serious scientific question. We usually don't think that that's the case. The general formulation is mind is what the brain does, no brain, no mind. But there are people out there who are willing to make an argument that somehow mind can be disembodied and exist independently of any kind of physical substrate. You see this in parapsychology. And you also see this in the popular literature about the out-of-body experience and near-death experiences and all of that. And if you don't believe that this is a serious issue right now, take a look at this week's and 2 weeks ago's issue of the New York Review of Books, which contains a massive 2-part review of a huge number of books, all of which are relating experiences in which people's minds left their bodies when they were at death's door and all of that, and trying to make sense of these things. And then finally, we get to this question about the behavior without mind. How important is consciousness to behavior? And the question of whether, in fact, consciousness is epiphenomenal after all, and consciousness plays no causal role in behavior. That it all does actually go on pretty much in the dark. If not in the dark, then at least in very dim light. Any questions here? All right. The corresponding chapters in Revensuel, not a lot of content in those 2 chapters, I got to say. Certainly not a lot of content that would be unfamiliar to you. Chapter 7 just goes through a whole bunch of brain imaging techniques, the kinds of techniques that cognitive neuroscientists try to use these days to establish things like the neural correlates of consciousness. And then chapter 9 basically is very abstract and very short, in which Revensuel kind of talks about what an experiment would look like that tried to establish what the neural correlates of consciousness are. This isn't a course on philosophy. This isn't a course on neuroscience either, okay? But there are some basic features of these brain imaging techniques that you should know about. You know, why somebody would prefer, say, fMRI to PET imaging, why somebody would prefer EEGs to MEGs or whatever for these kinds of studies. But you don't have to know how these techniques work, okay? That's way too technical for this course. There's graduate school for that. Okay. Anything here? Yeah. Well, you don't need to know the technical stuff, but for example, you ought to know that in both PET imaging and fMRI, you're looking at activations of more or less discrete areas of the brain when people perform various kinds of tasks. But, okay, for example, PET imaging has very poor temporal resolution. It takes a long time for those activations to become apparent, right? So you can't look at what's going on in the brain when somebody is performing some test that goes by really quickly. Whereas fMRI has very, very, very good temporal resolution. So things like differences between these techniques in spatial resolution versus temporal resolution, that's all in Revensuel, and that's the basic thing. So if somebody handed you, $1 million tomorrow and said, go find a neural correlate of consciousness, you'd have some sense of what brain imaging technique you'd want to use. Similarly, EEG is very sensitive over very short temporal periods, but it's not so good on localization. And the reason it's not so good on localization is that it's recording electrical activity in the brain from electrodes that are placed on the surface of the skull. So, it's just not great for trying to say the electrical activity is happening right there, okay? But with something like an event-related potential, you can observe changes in electrical activity on the order of 10 milliseconds, which is pretty good, yeah? All right. So then again, just kind of turn your attention again to those essays collected in Searle's book. And what you see in these chapters are, again, excellent examples of what the philosophical discussion looks like. I've already talked about Bennett's functionalism and Chalmers' version of dualism. But for example, in Searle's review of Francis Crick's book, you get some insights into somebody who really has not thought about consciousness much before. Francis Crick got the Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA, right? Not for doing any kind of neuroscience. And then later on, he decided, since he'd solved the problem of the origin of life, he'd try to figure out the origin of consciousness. And he wrote this book. And you know, what's the astonishing hypothesis? What's Crick's astonishing hypothesis? The astonishing hypothesis is that minds are products of brains. Now, first thing you want to ask is, what's astonishing about that, right? Okay, don't we know that somehow? But then it's what Crick does with that idea that minds are a product of brains that makes the book interesting. Roger Penrose, another distinguished scientist, is probably the world's leading proponent of two different kinds of ideas. One is a kind of philosophical idealism, of which we have not seen the like since Bishop Berkeley, where Penrose has the idea that there are some things that exist but don't exist in the material world. For example, mathematics. Okay, it's one of Penrose's example. It's true that 2 plus 3 equals 5 and whatever, but 2s and 3s and 5s don't have any kind of material existence. So he kind of uses that as a way of motivating people to take idealism seriously. And then Penrose is also very famous for arguing that consciousness, the physical basis of consciousness, has something to do with quantum mechanics. Again, this isn't a physics course. I don't know anything about quantum mechanics, except I think that Pat Churchland is right when she said that what Penrose is doing is basically relating two mysteries, solving one mystery by invoking another mystery. As she put it, consciousness is mysterious, quantum mechanics is mysterious, they must have something to do with each other, okay? And I don't know whether that's the right way to approach these things or not. So anyway, there's that. So then we talked about attention, and I gave you a little history of the evolution of concepts of attention. And the important thing there, the really important thing is this debate about the location of the attentional filter, which is really a debate about the extent of pre-attentive processing. How much processing of a stimulus can you do before you pay attention to it? Obviously, you have to do some processing of a stimulus before you pay attention to it, or you wouldn't know to pay attention to it, right? You got to find it. You got to notice it somehow. But these early selection